everyone. Good evening. My name is Belinda Tato. I am co-director of the Master in Design Engineering. Thank you so much for joining us today for this amazing lecture. I'm also an associate professor in practice of landscape architecture. So I'm going to read the The Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. I want to remind everybody, those who are joining us virtually, please click the closed captioning icon. And for you who are joining in person, please use the QR code that is on the screen to be able to see the captioning. Okay, so I'm just going to go a little bit about the next events. There is a lot going on. Give me 1 second. Okay. On March the 9th, Marina Otero will draw on research supported by the Wheelwright Prize to examine the architectures and politics of data processing and storage in a context shaped by technological competition and climate collapse. And the next day, March the 10th, Marina will be joined by Kate Crawford to dive deeper, examining possibilities for indigenous crowds, feminist servers, permaculture imaginaries, and low-tech computation. And for more information and to see the full lineup of upcoming events, please visit the GSD website. Okay, so I'm going to introduce now our great speakers. So Anthony Dunne and Fiona Raby are partners in the design studio Dunne and Raby. Through their projects and writing, they explore how speculative thought from science, philosophy, and literature can inform and expand design practice. Their books include Hertzian Tales, Design Noir, Speculative Everything, and Not Here, Not Now, the most recent one from 2025. Their projects are featured in permanent collections such as the Museum of Modern Art, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and MAC in Vienna. Their research has been supported by organizations like the European Commission, Wellcome Trust, Arts Council England, and the Mellon Foundation, among others, as well as industry partners including Intel and Microsoft. They have served as university professors of design and social inquiry at Parsons, the New School. They also received the inaugural MIT Media Lab Award in 2015 and were named Royal Designers for Industry and Life Fellows of the Royal Society in 2021. I would like to start by sharing a passage from your book, Speculative Everything, Design, Fiction, and Social Dreaming, which captures the spirit of your approach to speculative design. It is hard to say what today's dreams are. It seems they have been downgraded to hopes. Hope that we will not become extinct. Hope that we can feed the starving. Hope that there will be room for all of us on this tiny planet. There are no more visions. We don't know how to fix the planet and ensure our survival. We're just hopeful. As Frederick Jameson famously remarked, it is now easier for us to imagine the end of the world than an alternative to capitalism. Yet, alternatives are exactly what we need. We need to dream new dreams for the 21st century as those of the 20th century rapidly fade. But what role can design play? In a world where doubt, uncertainty, and the unknowable are becoming the new norms, design can help us engage meaningfully with the strange realities unfolding around us. We look forward to hearing your thoughts and getting inspired by your vision, and hopefully you can make us dream tonight. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming along this evening. And thank you, Belinda, for that warm introduction, and of course to Sarah for making all of this possible. I'm just going to jump straight in. So at a time when we're experiencing rapid accelerating marketization of seemingly every aspect of life, including education, increasing environmental instability and uncertainty, the realization that our techno-utopia might in fact be a dystopia, and the appearance of significant cracks in the political and economic system that while generating vast wealth, has completely failed to ensure its fair distribution, it's hard to focus on ideas that do not have immediate or obvious practical applications. And while significant efforts are being made in areas where design can contribute, such as rethinking the materiality of the human-made world and its impact on the community of life we share this planet with, it's also important to address the worlds we carry around inside us, worlds made from ideas, values, and belief systems from which new possibilities may eventually emerge if sufficiently nourished. But doing this often means designing for worlds that do not yet exist or might never exist, which can go against what we expect from design, even in education. Yet if there's one thing we'd like to emphasize in our talk tonight, is that speculative forms of design practice might be most valuable when they are constructively unrealistic, when they are unreal by design. Designs that aim to impact on our inner worlds, not just the physical world. If we can shift how we think, we might begin to behave differently. And if we do this, then reality might begin to change too. So one of the things that, for us at least, that design does really well is it gives tangible form or materiality to alternative belief systems, values, and ways of seeing the world, not to be implemented in our case, but to seed further imagining about how things could be otherwise. Physically, these objects are present in the here and now, but conceptually, they belong elsewhere. They don't quite fit in. We also like to reference the language of mainstream design to suggest a reality where mass-produced objects are designed to meet needs beyond practicality, designs to think with and through. But where can this happen? In design, people often talk about universities and the academic world as something separate from the real world. But for us, academia is real too. It just does a different job from the bits of the other world, the other real world. It can do things that are difficult or even impossible to do in other settings, complementing work happening in industry or design studios. An academic setting allows us to explore how design could be rather than how it is already. So for us, universities and art schools in particular are special places where new thinking can be developed, tested, and disseminated through teaching, research, and other channels. And we're interested in how to do this through design practice, as well as making room for this in the larger design world.
So back in 2014, we were asked to contribute to an exhibition called Future Fictions in Art and Design, and we were a little bit agitated by the term future. It seemed like the future was the only place we were allowed to imagine in. In design, if imagination isn't situated in the future, then it isn't considered to be real. It seems that there is no place for it, so we made one, and we called the project Not Here, Not Now. So in protest, so we designed a set of almost absurd fictional objects, products, and at the time, I don't think we realised a decade would pass and these ideas would become even more relevant to us than then. So it's unclear if these are actually objects or illustrations. Not Here, Not Now, although a parallel place, is still part of the space our bodies inhabit. The concrete floor, the plastic wall sockets, the white wall. Although 3D models, we deliberately use a strange axonometric viewpoint. The objects don't sit in the same plane as the photograph. They are slightly off. They float in between the space of Not Here, Not Now. So the ethiculator is essentially an ethics calculator. It challenges the person-to-screen interface of the iPhone, an outsized digital object the size of a table. The object requires eye contact between people, not to be used alone as you would an iPhone. It requires a small gathering and the sensuality of skin. So as a hand enters into the device, the sensors, dials are operated through atmospheres, through sweat, temperature, blood pressure, grip. It prioritizes the unspoken, what is not being said. It's a social tool for human decision-making. Everything is measured, as measuring is the process of legitimization. At the time, it was our response to the AI big data revolution we could see brewing on the horizon. How much will we outsource decision-making to technological systems? How far do we allow ethical decisions to be made by algorithms? It's not impossible to imagine. To relinquish responsibility, it'll be a huge relief, a much better life, less troubled. So when we first landed in New York at the New School in 2016, we were asked to contribute to a project at GIDES, which is the Graduate Institute of Design, Ethnography and Social Thought, a gathering predominantly of social science writers and scholars connecting theory and design. And as design practitioners, we don't write academic papers, so it's a little bit intimidating to be presenting to this group. Instead, we wanted to invite them into our world. So we wrote an official sounding report about a fictional visit we had made to a fictional place, recounting the things we had discovered during our visit. All our imaginary products are documented in the report, and we used our own curiosity and uncertainty as the lens into this unfamiliar place, with unfamiliar values and strange behaviours. I'll read a short extract. So, pacing around the space was a lady wearing a largish cube volume that rested on her shoulders and encased her head. It was made from a pink translucent material. We couldn't tell if it was fabric or something more rigid, or even a field of some kind. It stayed consistently in isometric projection, no matter how she moved. We noticed secondary volumes by her mouth and on her ears. On its surface, markings subtly changing from midtones to as she spoke. She kept repeating phrases like, and listening before she was speaking, maybe learning them. The phrases didn't quite make sense. Inventory leakage, right-sizing, misspeak, categorical inaccuracy, aristorhythm, heritage loan, bioshuffle. Our host told us that the woman was calibrating a publicly voiced device. And so since the recent amendment to the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, it had become essential for consumer citizens to familiarise themselves with public speak, a language entirely from euphemisms. So these products would never be manufactured. They would never exist beyond a single prototype. Being real is not their job. The strategy seems to work, and many dialogues and collaborations and friendships have actually came from this. And so we were a little bit relieved with our GIDES group. But it made us take more notice as practitioners and makers and visualisers how writing could be different to reflect the nuances of practice-based work.
So around the same time, we made a video of a lecture about the Austrian philosopher Alexius Mein-Young and his theory of objects. For Mein-Young, impossible objects like perpetual motion machines and round squares should be included in any taxonomy of objects. If we can think them, then they exist somewhere, even if it is in our collective imagination. To introduce us to the idea of impossible objects and their value for thinking with and through the limits we place on collective and individual imagining. Rather than dividing objects into real or not real, for Mein-Young, objects can be real, sort of real, hyper-real, not quite real, really real, and so on. Different shades of real. It's a little more abstract, but a little bit more poetic too. We worked with the author of a set of lectures about Mein-Young and illustrated little clips with Lucas Franciszkiewicz, who produced the visuals. I'm just going to play a few short clips now. Oh, yeah.
Someone's ontology is what they believe exists, or how they separate things into things that exist and things that don't exist. Generally, most philosophers are going to say that tables, mountains, people exist, while unicorns, round squares, and the King of France do not exist. There are going to be some borderline cases that people disagree on, such as numbers, minds, knowledge, and God. Whether or not those things exist may be up to debate. This is going to be our first bucket that objects can fall into. They are complete objects. They're determined with respect to all of their properties. They are things like cakes, tables, dogs, cats, hills, and stars. They exist in some tangible, real sense, and they subsist. Ideal objects are objects that subsist but don't exist. That's bucket number 2. What does that really mean? Well, they're complete objects as well. They're determined with respect to all their properties. But there are things like the state of affairs of the cake being on the table, or the state of affairs of the cake not being in the fridge. You can't really grab or hold the state of affairs of the cake being on the table. That relationship or that state of affairs is an ideal object. Or that state of affairs of not having cake in the fridge is an ideal object. The one that makes the most sense to me is the number of cakes in front of me, or numbers. These are ideal objects because it's just a state of affairs, a state of number of cakes on the table in front of me. We are now entering what is known as Mein-Yong's jungle. The reason it's called Mein-Yong's jungle is there's a question put to the proponent of Mein-Yong. The question is, well, you claim that all of these objects that don't exist exist. Well, where don't they exist? Or where are they such that they don't exist in the actual world, but they still exist? The answer, of course, is they exist in Mein-Yong's jungle, a crazy place full of impossible things. An object with only the property of being blue.
And with this object, with only the property of being blue, it's emblematic for us, and also where we ran up against a wall. It forced us to think a little more deeply about what exactly we meant by impossible. And for a long time, our archive consisted of empty shelves as we struggled to figure out what it meant to design impossible objects.
So our first attempt was a set of globes. They were part of a 150-year Bauhaus celebrations, and we were commissioned to design an object as part of the Mies van der Rohe house at Krefeld in Germany. So in our investigations, we came across these wonderful historic mathematical models for exploring geometries made of plaster and string. We liked the idea from the curators of blueprints, frameworks, and models. So in design, the term prototype is used to test an idea within existing world views. The prototype is used to see if something works, whereas a model offers a little more freedom and openness, a different kind of engagement for those who encounter them. So I think a lot has been written about models in architecture, but not so much in design. But handcrafted, they were expensive to produce. So objects like these would be regularly bought by universities to make mathematical concepts more accessible for scholars, bought by libraries for public access. And we love this idea of lending conceptual ideas in model form for public consumption and for, a collective contemplation. The plaster ones were exquisitely made, but prohibitively outside of our allocated budget. So I can spend hours exploring a globe, enjoying the spatial relationships in my mind, but usually there's only one globe, a geographical representation of the Earth. So why is there only one? And we proposed a collection of 10, each representing a different way of viewing the world. Some probing reality itself. We gathered them from literature, the fringes of science and mathematics, thought experiments, an object from the edge of the universe, and a conspiracy theory. So each globe represents a different kind of imagination, not just scientific. And initially, we collected them as these separate worlds. But soon realized they needed to be brought together. They needed to jostle, invade each other's space, interrupt each other. It was important that these different realities sit next to each other, take up equal space on the table. They are all real, and they all exist. So they're from different kinds of gravity or space-time. We have a hyperboloid from fiction writer Greg Egan. His world was with 2 dimensions of space rather than 3, and he had 2 dimensions of time instead of 1. And he imagined what it might be like to live there. We had a toroidal Earth, which is a scientific thought experiment by scientist Anders Sandberg. He imagines a different kind of atmosphere, day and night, geospheres, tidal forces, and of course at the end we had a flat Earth. So the cuboid Earth is a curious thought experiment from astrophysicist Karen Masters. It was in response to a schoolchild asking, well, what if the Earth would be like if it were a cube? And she worked out the gravity and weather and the topography. So the oceans and atmosphere would become a sphere, corners would become mountains poking through the atmosphere, the oceans would be moved to the centre of each face. Although cubic planets do not exist, they do have a place in science imagination, modelling and exploring how gravity might work differently. So originally we wanted to cover the globes with markings, but that again turned out to be way too expensive. So instead we kept them blank, referencing the original historical plaster models that we showed at the beginning. But we created visual maps to be displayed on the walls as imaginative prompts with the hope that other interpretations would accumulate over time. And we used conventional markings to suggest speculative atmospheres, climates, geologies, forces and fields different from those shaping our world. So a few years later, in an exhibition called Space is the Place, an exhibition in Mudak in Lausanne, the curators used the models to gather many historical interpretations of the Earth and the universe together. It was exciting for us to see this process of, the process of accumulating knowledge, different representations of historical belief, all together in one space. Theories about how the world has changed over time and continues to evolve, and our globes added another layer. Multiple bodies of knowledge from diverse imaginations that otherwise might not be represented. So the globes were located in the woman's room, a place historically men would rarely enter. I like to imagine that a very different curiosity was at work here, less constrained and conformist. We like that design brings ideas into contact with everyday life, sitting alongside a vase of flowers, a lamp, a set of keys. So they were displayed on a table rather than a plinth. And in the Pompidou Centre, the globes were placed on a super studio table, which we thought was a very playful pairing. So we have always wanted our objects to be in domestic spaces rather than galleries, but the economics of design manufacture never makes this impossible. In today's reality, everyday objects like this seem highly unlikely. They are designs for non-existent worlds. And with no natural home for this kind of work, we became increasingly drawn to archives, particularly for worlds that don't exist, but worlds that can still be thought, the concrete and the imaginative world working together.
So there are, of course, many different kinds of impossible. Some thinkers argue that the impossible cannot even be conceived, or that once it is thought or imagined, it ceases to be impossible. Or like René Descartes, his 1,000-faced geometric figure, it can be intellectually grasped but not imagined. In design, when people hear the term impossible object, they might think of Jacques Carlemann's 1969 catalogue of unfindable objects that play with functional logic, like the coffee pot in the bottom right. According to Wikipedia, impossible objects, also known as impossible figures, consist of a two-dimensional figure which is instantly and subconsciously interpreted by a visual system as representing a projection of a three-dimensional object, although it is not geometrically possible for such objects to exist. But a more interesting example is the duck-rabbit illusion. Although usually treated as an image, the physical version is even more enjoyable to behold. This one is by artist Simon Cunningham. But perhaps the closest idea to what we are thinking of is Mark Fisher's idea of the weird. The weird is a particular kind of perturbation. It involves a sensation of wrongness. A weird entity or object is so strange that it makes us feel that it should not exist, or at least it should not exist here. Yet if the entity or the object is here, then the categories which we have up until now used to make sense of the world cannot be valid. The weird thing is not wrong after all. It's our conceptions that must be inadequate. And this is where we started to shift our attention onto the frameworks we use to make sense of objects and the world around us, in fact. So when we came across the vegetable lamb in Margaret Robinson's wonderfully titled book, Fictitious Beasts, a bibliography from 1961, for many years this zoophyte was said to exist in Central Asia. It was thought to grow in a stalk that was sometimes interpreted as an umbilical cord that also served as a tether, allowing it to eat the grass and plants around it, and once it was gone, it died. In another book from 1887, The Vegetable Lamb of Tartary by Henry Lee, he writes that its meat tasted sweet like honey, and that its wool was used to make clothing for those living locally. Its only predators besides people were wolves. This, of course, is one of many possible creatures thought to exist just beyond the boundaries of Western geography. For us, the vegetable lamb brings to life the ever-shifting history of ideas and concepts, entities, objects, and other things, whether material or not, that can appear and disappear over time, moving from the real to the unreal or from the actual to the imagined. Historian Darren Aldridge puts it nicely in his book Strange Histories. If rational people in the past could believe in demonically possessed apples and execute pigs, witches, and heretics, then rational people today should consider the potential strangeness of their own ideas. To put it another way, will people in the future find our beliefs as ridiculous as the ideas of witch-finders now seem to us? This shift in perspective has some fascinating implications. First, draws attention to the process by which all people, including us, make sense of the world around them. For us, the vegetable lamb is a kind of emblem for the notion that reality is a metaphysical work in progress, a reminder that many of our most firmly held beliefs might turn out to be conceptual vegetable lambs when viewed from a future vantage point. So much of the 1800s, the US Patent Office in Washington, D.C. required a model as well as a written description and drawings to be submitted for every invention registered. The model was about 12 inches by 12 inches by 12 inches maximum. The idea was to enable someone with some technical skills and knowledge to make use of the device. Inventors, patent agents, and even the public could visit and request an object for study. We read in a catalogue that the models were also a way to educate the public, stimulate creativity and enterprise, and inspire a sense of America's destiny. These sewing machines, for example, not only represent different technical innovations, but also different aesthetic and cultural possibilities. They belong to possible worlds that never happened. So the patent library made us wonder if an archive of impossible objects could serve as a sort of public museum where people could encounter physical fragments from different ways of thinking about reality. Like our globes, these objects could come from the edges of science, where alternative and often competing models of reality flourish. The imagining of writers who spend their days constructing expansive fictional realities, and the history of ideas that trace how what is considered real at any moment in time can fade in and out of existence, leaving behind infrastructures, institutions, ideas, and objects belonging to outmoded reality systems that shape and limit the reality they continue to exist within. Our archive is modest. Perhaps it's located in an abandoned office space. Here someone has requested an object to study. It's set next to the chair.
So in 2023, we were visiting designers at CERN. It was a wonderful example of how theory and practice naturally coexist in science. We met with incredible physicists. So 1 minute with a mathematician and a chalkboard in an intimate meeting room, writing out formulas, drawing diagrams about particles and universes. And the next, we're in these huge warehouses full of pipes, structures, motors, enormous chambers to capture and observe the smallest of particles. These things all happening together, each shaping ideas, collectively bouncing off each other, theory and practice naturally coexisting. So Tony and I, we love to hear the latest thoughts on quantum science. For us, we see it as part of our everyday world. So why can't design objects be inspired by particle physics? So we were reading that a team of physicists built a small-scale wormhole inside a quantum computer, a quantum circuit mathematically equivalent to a wormhole, and sending a qubit through it, bringing two seemingly incompatible theories together, gravitational wormholes and quantum entanglement. Skeptics did point out that this was, of course, a simulation, not an actual wormhole. Then theoretical physicist Leonard Susskind suggests that the space inside a magnetic resonance imaging scanner could be seen as a modest mini-universe, a kind of pocket universe. Of course, we love this, although one of the scientists sort of told us that this might be overstating things a little. And then there is cosmogenesis, a field of science thinking about how baby universes could be created in labs, already finding its way into fiction in Jonathan Letham's novel. It's a romance between a particle physicist and a mini black hole artificially created in a lab. It seemed perfectly feasible that a deep love could grow around the origins of the universe. So a baby universe seemed to fit our archive of impossible objects. It's not real or possible now, but something being thought about. Science working on the imagination, expanding it, enlarging reality, enlarging what we think the world is, and how we understand the malleability of reality. So for us, these objects aim to bring ideas like this into conversation with our daily lives, intended for the home, upholstered, situated besides tables, chairs, sofas and shelving units, designed to meet very different needs, more contemplative needs, nurturing our inner worlds. So the quantum computer sits at the very edges of reality. For a quantum computer to work, it needs to be isolated from the physical world, completely separate from the world. Any interference in a qubit collapses from a state of multiple possibilities into a single state, losing any information stored. Increasing computer power is not so interesting for us, that part, but the contested theories behind the science is the challenge for us. So physicist David Deutsch in the 80s, an advocate of the many worlds interpretation, said a quantum computer is the only way to test his theory. Photons literally operating in a parallel world simultaneously. And of course, many scientists disagree with this interpretation, but we enjoy how it brings philosophy and science together. So we asked DALI 2 to visualize a quantum computer, and it really did struggle. There was very little kind of visual imagery out there. But when we added Hieronymus Bosch into the equation, it brought up the Garden of Earthly Delights, an unexpected visualization, which sort of made sense to us. And of course, we had to add it to our archive. So after 100 years after quantum mechanics was first conceived, quantum computers are beginning to enter into the popular imagination. And we wondered if other concepts and ideas from quantum theory might also materialize into daily life and even challenge Newtonian imagery. Imagery that we're so used to, such as cause and effect, predictability and determinism, being in one place at one time, the idea of one world. We called this quantum common sense, an intentional oxymoron linking two worlds that would normally never meet. Particularly as common sense today is not really making much sense. Common sense seems to be at odds to the world taking shape around us. Perhaps quantum common sense, oddly, could be a more accurate representation. So Schrödinger's cat is the most famous of all impossible objects, both alive and dead until the box is opened. But one of the most controversial interpretations, again, the Hugh Everett many worlds interpretation, for him, when Schrödinger's box is open, rather than the cat being either dead or alive in this world, if the cat is alive, then another world branches off where the cat is dead, an entirely new universe. And of course, for many critics, this is outrageous. Where do all these worlds exist and how? But for many advocates, this theory offers an elegant explanation of quantum reality. And we wondered how we could approach this as designers and cultural investigators interested in objects and materiality.
So we always tried to connect our research to our teaching, and we're lucky to be able to teach a class exploring the idea of quantum common sense at Parsons, the New School. The class attracted designers from different specialisms, a composer, fine art photographers, historians and theorists, and even an astrophysicist who had previous experience with quantum mechanics, which proved very handy for us. And I'll very briefly mention one project, the Many-Worldian Artifact Hunter by Shashwath Santosh. So Shashwath was very taken by the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is a familiar trope in science fiction and cinema. But he wanted to see what it felt like to adopt this view, to internalize it. And of course, if you adopt this view, it will generate lots of contradictory emotions. For example, in his case, quantum guilt, classical arrogance, many-worldian existentialism, and many-worldian envy. He decided to test what a many-worldian mindset felt like while walking across the city of New York, a little like method acting. To do this, he used an actual app called the Universe Splitter to decide which route to take at a junction. The app is real and can be downloaded onto your phone. The Universe Splitter allows you to take truly random decisions, unlike flipping a coin, which is still Newtonian. To make a decision, in this case, which turn to take, the Universe Splitter contacts a quantum device in a laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland, which within seconds releases single photons into a partially silvered mirror, so that each photon will have two possible paths. And if you're a believer of the many worlds interpretation, the photon will take both parts, but in separate universes, thereby splitting the universe into the route Shashwath took and the one he didn't. So Shashwath ended up with two possible universes, A and B. To record each decision, he picked up discarded artifacts from whichever universe he found himself in, placing them in one of two bags labeled Universe A and Universe B. And ultimately, the project was about two things: adopting a many-worldian mindset to see what it actually felt like, and using design to bring this kind of thinking to a wider audience through very lightweight but still spontaneous conversations on the streets of New York. Another approach might be to explore a quantum imaginary. A lack of quantum-related imagery led us to wonder how a fictional quantum age might be visually expressed through the stuff of everyday life. More than just styling, of course. It's about giving form to new values, beliefs, dreams, hopes, and fears in the way Art Nouveau or Art Deco did in the past. So in another class, a product design student, Evan Rayner, designed a series of what he called pseudo-physical objects, exploring dimensionality through the redesign of everyday things. A pencil, for example, is rotated about its vertical axis at a slight angle, resulting in a double cone pencil. A billiard board is modeled in motion, striking another. Although not directly linked to quantum physics, I like how it suggests designing from a very, very different starting point, a set of assumptions about objects, space, and time.
So we do the same thing with a project around the non-human, and it's another space of unknowability. Again, a placeholder for a larger conversation. There are lots of vibrant explorations going on in the more than human, decentering the human, multi-species world building, debunking the notion that human intelligence is the only intelligence of importance. It's illuminating and exciting, but often still human-centered, welcoming the non-humans into human worlds. So how to shift mindsets beyond human exceptionalism is a knotty and difficult paradoxical space. So when we first moved to New York, we didn't expect this, a vast continent, the landscapes of America, spaces humans rarely enter. We tentatively explored them under a thin layer of fabric, carrying the only most essentials for shelter, warmth, and food. They feel like separate worlds where different logics prevail, not human-centered at all, with human needs, but those of other creatures and beings, of non-humans. And to spend any time in these places requires a great deal of preparation. It's a struggle to exist outside of human worlds we've created with their abundant infrastructures. At the same time, we moved from the city to the woodland to live full-time. It had a profound effect on our everyday existence. So the walls of the house defined our threshold. The inside was the human bit, but directly outside we stepped into a multi-species zone shared with other creatures. The woodland is distinctly not a human space. We were acutely aware that it didn't belong to us. However, we did experience multi-species boundaries on a daily basis, and there are some limits to the sharing that can go on. Thomas Saraceno wants us to allow the spiders to flourish, and so do I, but in the mornings when half asleep and one appears at the bathroom window the size of a tea plate, it's not so comfortable. And during the 3-week-long mating season, the green grasshoppers are escorted from the house almost hourly. I have them in a kind of a cup, taking them outside. And they're not small things. I have no idea how they get in. We'd sleep under a mosquito net, otherwise the moths would land on us in the night. Fireflies signal to each other around the room, oblivious of the house walls and the fictional segregation we had in place. So that all romantic notions were stripped away with the brutal realities of storms, floods, falling trees, power, water, internet disruption, and a deep-seated existential fear is always present.
At the same time, for the last few years, we taught a class with cultural theorist Dominic Petman called Who Comes After the Human, for a mix of design, art, social science, and creative writing students. They provided us with some very useful theoretical concepts for framing the experiences Fiona just mentioned and developing this thinking a bit further. So one idea that stayed with us is the Umwelt. In the 1930s, biologist Jakob von Utzkull called the world each creature experiences through its unique sensory organs and perceptual system an Umwelt. In non-human Umwelten, based on different senses, olfactory, electrical, seismic, magnetic, auditory, phenomenon lacking materiality for us might be concrete and tangible. and what is seemingly solid to another creature might be imperceptible to us. For a dog, for instance, the smell of the coffee might be more present or real than a cup or tray. Time would be different too. If we were to leave the room, our scent would linger, complicating what it means to be present now. Of course, this approach is full of contradictions. It's impossible to truly imagine what this would be like. We're always limited by our human imagination and senses. So this inquiry is more about shifting perspective, seeing ourselves and the human-made world differently, and our impact on other life forms, not by attempting to fully comprehend non-humanness, but by celebrating its alienness and unknowability, something we believe is essential if we are to truly engage with the more than human, beyond welcoming them into an already too human world. So this quote highlights a subtle but important difference for us between simulating what it looks like for humans to perceive like a bat, for instance, and speculating on what it means for a human to be perceived by a bat within a bat's world or reality. The former suggests a bolt-on to the human sensorium that expands it to see what we normally can't, while the latter asks us to reimagine ourselves in a world shaped by non-human sensory and cognitive systems. The idea is to use non-human perception as a design constraint to destabilize human assumptions. So we wondered how a human might appear in a generalized non-human world, not for specific life forms. Some life forms might live in worlds where the human body's shape is meaningless. We appear more like clouds, atmospheres, or energy fields as our fleshiness fades. The waves and air disturbances we create might be as present as our meatiness, or even more present. We read that bears can smell up to a mile away. Does this mean that we extend through their world as delicate molecular strands, entering their bodies and becoming entangled with them? And of course, a transformed human figure would not be alone. All life forms would shapeshift as they pass through different Umwelten.
But when we tried to explain, it was still far too abstract. How to bring this abstract idea into everyday worlds? So we thought about a fictional festival, a yearly event where the humans celebrate non-human worlds, bringing these very abstract ideas into tangible, everyday forms. We used everyday representations of teacups, teapots, boats, cars, radios, ordinary things. We put everything on poles to suggest objects being carried in a procession. We experimented a lot. And in between festivals, the poles and other objects might live in the home as mementos, keepsakes passed down through generations, serving as daily reminders to be regularly mindful of non-human worlds. During our research, we discovered that the vibrations and noise from the engine of a boat to certain ocean creatures are more solid than the boat. The invisible part is far more real. And instinctively, it feels like these volumes should be delicate, floaty, barely there. But that's a very human perspective again. So although counterintuitive, we explored materials that suggested solidity. The ephemeral plume is solid, and the fleshy human figure is transparent. So we were given an opportunity to develop these objects and this idea from a commission for an exhibition at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. So the museum connected us to an excellent team at the School of Design of Architecture at RMIT, who we worked with to develop and to produce the objects. So the makers in RMIT drew our attention to a very special timber, Tasmanian Huon pine. It's dredged from the harbours. It sat under the water surface for 100 years with no sign of rot. These trees are now protected, and the timber comes from fallen branches and not in standard sizes, so it's all glued in layers. It's resilient and has a beautiful tight grain, perfect for machining complex forms. It created a very different aesthetic than we would have imagined ourselves, defined by the tree. This is partially assembled plume, and the final piece is about 4 feet long. So the festival goers would probably wear accessories like gloves, hats and shoes, bringing people together in a shared collective display. We imagined this to be a festival glove, a click, a sound made solid. A small human gesture becomes exaggerated in non-human worlds. We love that the festival format allows for exaggeration, for absurdity, alternative logics, heightened emotion and celebration. And this is the final glove. And from the modernist point of view, we think of air as empty space, but of course it is teeming with life and many different materials at a microscopic level. In a world of many worlds, the physical teapot might be less present than the air around it. So the teapot is not the container. The air around it becomes contained. The teapot is inside out, made of glass to see the inversion. So language and identity might need to change. Objects become unified into new multi-layered object identities. They had strange, awkward names when we were making them. This was the teapot, steam, air. And the rucksack object. So this refers to our experiences we had in these vast landscapes, places that accentuate the vulnerability and insignificance of human life on non-human worlds. So when hiking in remote places, a shift can occur of how you'll see yourself and your body. If something were to happen and you become aware very quickly that you become biomass to be recycled and processed by a multitude of life forms, for which you are simply calories, nutrition, raw materials, or a home, you begin to see yourself as stuff. So the backpack represents your body as a biomass and is carried by the festival goers. We imagine this to be a rich soil full of creatures and microorganisms, minerals and planetary matter to remind us that we're part of this very large ecological and planetary system on our backs. But soil is prohibited within the museum, so we worked with mycelium expert Joshua Reisel. We wanted to keep the idea of microbial digestion and decomposition. We also did a parallel study with the Design Museum in London with experts Osmos, and we wanted to grow the figures in mycelium. So often it's the preparation and anticipation can be more important than the festival itself, a social process involving local communities. We imagined organic pieces that grow over time, collective making and growing, and then a yearly ritual, and at the end they're composted or recycled at the end. So we will never know what it's like to be another species, a living species. We will never experience their sensory lives. But every attempt is an essential exercise in empathy, stretching human imagination. Ultimately, it's about celebrating their alienness and unknowability, acknowledging the inaccessibility of their worlds.
So in design, for us at least, it feels like we have a very limited range of concepts for thinking about the kind of things we've spoken about this evening. And the final chapter of our recent book, Not Here, Not Now, is called A Non-Standard, Incomplete Glossary of the Not Here, Not Now, and it explores language and concepts from other fields that have been speculating far longer than design has. And it all strikes us how odd it is that, as design educator Matt Ward put it in his essay Design Fiction and the Logic of the Impossible, we are a discipline that is reliant on creativity and imagination but become terrified of the imaginary. Other disciplinary imaginations go far beyond what design deems permissible, showing that reality may not be as realistic as we think. There are quantum physicists who entertain the idea that new worlds branch off from this one each time a choice is made. Cosmologists who believe that one day we may be able to create baby universes in a lab, and philosophers who engage in possible worlds talk, where in one world there is indeed a king of France. We believe design has much to learn from these fields, and that we need to create learning environments to explore this more, putting design into conversation with philosophy, speculative forms of science, and literature. Fields that have a long history of working with ideas that stretch the imagination and allow us to see beyond the constraints of existing realities, encouraging designers to become what the writer Ursula Le Guin has called realists of a larger reality, a reality that fully embraces the imagination and all that is yet to exist or might never exist. We'll finish here. Thank you. So, I think there's time for questions if anyone has any.
Oh, hey. Sorry for asking a question. How do you feel about this turn away from our political reality? I know that's not an easy question to answer, and it's just more of an observation. Is it at all within your interests in applying this to really facing the political reality?
I think it depends what you mean by politics. I mean, on the one level, there is political activity, and you need to work in the political realm to participate over many, many decades to have even a small impact. But I think there's the politicalness in what we do every day. And I think maybe what we have aligned ourselves with is actually creating spaces, particularly in education, where people can imagine more freely. Providing frameworks for that and linking that to larger systems of thought is where we see, I wouldn't say it's political, but it's a way we see of trying to participate in a larger kind of endeavor or project. So I think there is a distinction between maybe activism, politics proper, and the politics of your field. And I think on that level, it's through trying to create spaces within educational context that work with imagination in ways that might not be possible in other spaces.
But I just think we feel that this kind of work sits alongside. It's not the end in itself. It sits alongside.
I understand.
So in some ways, everything is, there's a lack of imagination. So how can we kind of open up the spaces? I think with a lot of professional expertise, we work a lot with professional expertise, and it seems that everyone's working very, in a very direct kind of way, and there's very little room for stepping outside on any sort of side to sort of enlarge that space. So I think that's how we see this work. It always sits alongside and not is the sort of centre of the universe.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was intriguing and beautiful and just delightful. So thank you. I'm very curious if you could say a little bit more about how those methodologies take root in the educational setting. I mean, how does this work in a classroom? I would be curious to hear more.
Okay, we can very briefly talk about it. But I think in our roles, for example, at the New School where we used to teach, we worked across the whole university. So classes were open to students from all disciplines, not just designers and artists. And I think what was interesting, for example, was in a class, say, on world building, we might have anthropologists, philosophers, sociologists, economists, and it provided the space where rather than saying, come on into the design world and we'll teach you some design skills, it was more, here's a space where you can speculate, drawing on the deep knowledge you have in economics or anthropology, and start to make propositions about how things could be otherwise, which often is not I'm speaking generally here, but it's often difficult within the home disciplines. So the designers would start to see how the other disciplines are kind of embarking on a voyage of discovery or inquiry, and also shift them away from thinking about framing everything as problems and solutions and so on. But what became interesting over time was many of the, say, social scientists hadn't visual backgrounds, but they wanted to use vehicles to talk about their ideas other than essays. So they would do contracts, investment portfolios, constitutions, and these other kinds of instruments that, in a way, thinking of Mein Young, were kind of objects, and kind of expanded the scope of what counted as a thing or an object in the class, using those to carry the ideas that they would explore, and then bringing them back into their home disciplines, often to create lots of debate and discussion.
And so in the same way, we were a class that sat alongside.
Yeah.
So everyone's kind of doing their main projects and thesis, and we would be a point where they could come and take one small part of their project and try and explore it in a way further than they might want to do within their class. So it gave them a tiny bit more space at which to experiment within. And then so you'd have lots of different experimentation from very, very different backgrounds, from, from a fashion designer who's trying to understand something to a kind of a graphic or a photographer or an anthropologist or something. So that space of inquiry and experimentation we wouldn't obviously be the experts in their field, they would be the experts in their fields, but enabling them this a little bit more space to try something out was kind of where we saw this kind of work sitting.
Good evening, and thank you very much. I've been a long-time learner from the speculative method and thinking with your work. And I want to go back to maybe maybe a question that your work has got me thinking of for a while, and that maybe builds on some of the earlier conversation, which is that relationship between speculation and experimentation as a method, particularly with respect to objects or things. Like, I'm thinking maybe through the lens of historians of technology, who always reckon with the many bicycles that have not been, or the many other experiments, where there's some moment in which either the scientific experiment of a value judgment deems some objects worthy of further commercialization. I mean, the history of electricity might be another place to go that. So there's almost a lever within history, if we're imagining Archimedes, that kind of serves to ask the questions of the thing in the now, so that the imaginative respond to considerations maybe of the failures of the real, to open up alternatives. So it's basically maybe an opening between a certain valuations among the many alternatives, and how is a design imagination geared maybe to support some. And I want to maybe go back to that quote by Ursula Le Guin, because I really like it, and I think it's maybe worth to build on that question of the political, kind of putting it in its context, because I think speculative fabulation, particularly if the feminist tradition, comes from that reckoning with the uneven distribution of the reality of the world. And the quote goes, I think hard times are coming when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now, and can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine some real grounds for hope. We will want writers who can remember freedom, poets, visionaries, the realists of a larger reality. And I think designers would fall into that. But I think maybe it's a certain directionality or a desire or an aspiration. Like if you were handed a magic wand, the witch's magic wand, and thought of implementing changes in the real, would there be particular lever points through which you would imagine that alternative or that other word through which?
I think a multiplicity of coexistence is the thing. We often talk about it, that we would see, rather than one reality or one possibility or an ideal world. I mean, we were talking today in the class earlier about AI and the monolithic nature of it at the moment, and how even on something technological like that, the lack of plurality in alternative visions for how that might play out, entangled with different political, economic, and cultural systems. And I think for us, design is kind of a catalyst in even just providing glimpses into how things could be different. Not to say, and choose this one, or choose that one, or let's evaluate them, but to just keep reminding us that there are many there are many bicycles, many cars, many of which would have perhaps, especially with cars, I think electric cars were invented very early on and abandoned, that could have served us much better today. So I think one of the things we may be shifted from is trying to set out a future or a possibility and then debate that, or maybe not in our case, but futurists would try to figure out how to get there, to celebrating a multiplicity, even if we're not committing to one in particular, but trying to enrich the space around us in some way.
I think that there is a little bit of self-policing that goes on within the design school sometimes, where when doing a magic wand, this multiplicity of thinking is what I would like, to see within even in the classroom, how sometimes everyone's very quick to come up with a solution, and yet that opening up this space of possibility, where multiple possibilities from different can kind of enlarge that space a little bit more. We're finding that definitely in school, that's a bigger struggle, and that's where our little kind of space within the university became this space to open that up again, from the pressures to produce a particular kinds of projects in design school. So I think that
yes, if we could wave a magic wand, a huge magic wand, it would be to move away from this kind of Darwinian idea that one form of something has to win out and then dominate, and instead somehow what is the framework that would allow multiplicity of ways of being to coexist without one having to be somehow emerge as the winner or the dominant form?
And could education be that space?
A prototype for it.
A prototype.
Thanks for a great talk and great to see you here. Just picking up on your final comments, I'm really interested in how you found your shift from all your years at the Royal College of Art to the world of American academia, both in terms of the kinds of conversations that were being had there and how your work is perceived over here. Maybe could you comment also on your work teaching in China in terms of how your work is seen there and the different opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to comment on how your work is seen. I don't think we can do that. But I think, the shift was interesting. As you know, we were kind of very interested in how design and different kinds of technologies came together, and particularly around imagining the implications of different futures. And when we went to the New School, I think one of the attractions was to engage with the political scientists, social theorists, and so on, and maybe go a little further into the kind of politics of that. But whilst there, we sort of ended up spinning around and finding what was going on in the humanities and philosophy departments in a way more interesting and allow us to rethink our relationship to reality or the world in more subtle ways, rather than trying to make a political manifesto, for example, in design form. So we kind of went on quite a long and windy journey while we were there to, I guess, we were interested in technology, and we were interested for a little while in the social sciences, and came out of the New School being more interested in the humanities or the post-humanities and how design might connect.
But the RCA was, like a tiny art school in comparison. So, what we did there was, we managed to kind of work across an art school. And what was really lovely about coming out to the New School was being able to cross across a much broader range of sort of disciplines and ideas. We were exposed to, a much richer kind of space, which was, quite an enormous country of landscapes. And even, our experience of the landscape changes dramatically. So I don't think we could ever have done this last book without being in America. I don't think we could have done it in London, and I'm not sure how I ticked. But we had a very tight, small. We were in a very efficient running art college, but coming to America kind of really blew it open in ways that we could never have imagined, actually.
I think it's one of the differences between the educational system. In the UK we have departments, and we ran a department at the RCA, and it's very holistic, and you're thinking about how this relates to opportunities as they are. And I think in the US system, where you're teaching classes that are all overlapping and sitting alongside each other, you can actually offer classes that are quite free and open, and spaces for students to come and experiment in ways that are often quite difficult within a departmental or program framework. So I think a lot of the classes served as labs, really, for students from different disciplines to push us as well, and challenge and push back against what we were doing in ways that would have been harder within a departmental framework. I think in China, something very different is happening, and we just get glimpses. But one glimpse that we've had is how, of course, the students are engaging with international technological trends and hype and so on. But they seem to be, in the few years we've been involved, increasingly digging into Chinese culture, mythology, history, even of different histories of science and technology, and sort of fusing them into really confident and quite imaginative outcomes that I think contrast a lot with what we're seeing here in the US and also in the UK. But that's a complicated, long conversation, but thank you for the question.
And I think the other thing is, though, the making process. One of the things we found was it was so expensive to make in New York that was something that we were missing a lot, that process of making sort of not just making the objects, but I think the social fabric of London is quite mixed and messy, and I think we were really missing that. So I think it would be really lovely to go back into translating some of this stuff back into material. So we're looking forward to material exploration a lot more, because we weren't really able to do that so much in New York.
Yeah, there's one up there.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. The reference to Mark Fisher's concept of the weird was striking to me, and I'm curious to kind of dig into that. I feel like we're at a time, at least in visual culture, where weird has gone mainstream, and with artificial images, like, everything looks weird. And I think it also carries very specific political connotations now, with this kind of mass adoption of the weird and the somewhat off. And considering the kind of use of artificial images in your practice, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this kind of mass adoption of the weird. And also, yeah, I mean, you referenced it a little in your last kind of response, but the role of craft in your guys' practice. I was also struck by the story about the kind of wood sourced in Australia. It was really interesting, but yeah, just a little bit more about those kind of topics would be interesting to hear.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean about the weird. I think for us, it was everything else in that paragraph that was interesting. And in a sense, our version is the impossible object. I know that has its own history and baggage as well, partly to untangle ourselves from the weird. But just the way he framed whether they're weird objects, impossible objects, or strange things, I thought was just a really helpful way of shifting attention onto the frameworks we use to make sense of things that seem not to fit. In our case, they are those impossible objects. But I think the making side is really important, because a process like even that quantum computer, the Hieronymus Bosch one, was a DALI 2 image from a few years ago. But we worked with someone to develop it into a physical thing that we could perhaps make at some point, not obviously just as a model. And I think for us, that editing process of moving away just from weird imagery that can literally, as you say, be anything, to still thinking about what happens when it becomes a physical thing in the room that we sort of engage with through all our senses is quite important for us. I think also, I mean, we were talking about this recently, there's something that's just missing from so much of the kind of AI-generated imagery that's just very hard to pin down. There's a kind of more subtle strangeness that can somehow be crafted when humans are involved directly, even though it's very difficult to say what exactly it is, whether it's about editing or it's about deep layering of meanings or something like that. So, but I do hope that all of this proliferation of this kind of imagery kind of re-energizes the imaginative side of design, not in a kind of an undisciplined kind of trashy way, but in really thinking about what does it mean for a human to imagine when computers, they're not strictly imagining, but when they seem to be doing stuff that competes with human imagination. And maybe it will open up a much deeper pursuit of trying to understand human imaginative potential in a much more rigorous and interesting way that maybe one day will deviate from all that kind of stuff.
But I think it's that also craft and crafting in the editing and decision making. I mean, you can generate hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and we've actually been with students who generate hundreds and hundreds of images, and you're going, well, which one's interesting, and why? It comes down to, well, if you rather than have all of them, so this idea of crafting the idea of what's valuable within a context, is still there's still a lot in that of working out why this one and not that one, and why that's too far and why that's not enough. I still think there's a lot of kind of critical when people who use it really well, I think, have done hundreds and hundreds, and they've really kind of focused down, and that's become a human kind of decision, a collective decision of why a particular image resonates and all the others don't. So I think there's still, I'm still hopeful.
Thank you very much, both, for this absolutely wonderful lecture. I'm very curious. You start with hope and imagination, and I'm just very curious, especially in this political climate, considering deepfake and our relationship with generative AI and how it's been used in this political climate. I'm very curious to hear what is your relationship with despair and disappointments.
Well, I think
interesting question.
I think we try to resist you know, it could consume you and destroy you, and creativity goes with it. And I think for us, it's trying to not deny it in any way, but to look at, it's not just being optimistic and it's not just being hopeful, it's trying to find a path that allows you to keep thinking, generating ideas, interacting with people, discovering stuff, sharing stuff. And of course, it's very small scale, but I think that's something that we try to do. If you think if you think about the larger picture, you could just give up everything. But I think it's interesting to the space between fake and fiction, and I think it comes up a lot. And I think for us, it's kind of like saying fiction needs to express its fictionalism. It's kind of, you should see it and it kind of feels like fiction. It's not trying to be real. And I think the fakeness kicks in when something's trying to be real and has to fake it. And I think with the most interesting speculative work, there's no attempt to fake it. It is fiction. And some kind of aesthetic quality exists that you understand this isn't trying to be real or trying to hoax or trying to be fake. It is accepting its unreal status, but still trying to help us think about something or imagine something differently. But I mean, you saw it, your question made us go silent because it is just a massive topic, and I think our way is to just chip away on a small scale.
There is one more here if there's room. Yeah. I'm sorry I was late for your lecture, so please, feel free to skip answering the question, but maybe you already touched upon it. So, like, one of the most interesting critique of critical design and speculative design, in my opinion, is the one that is trying to argue that the site of critical design and speculative design is not within educational setups, but in so-called real world, in true emergent situations. So, like, the true critical designer will be the one who is actually struggling for survival and is kind of, hacking the system in order to survive, for instance, and thus engages in some kind of critical form of design or counter-design. And the same with speculative design. Those people who, for instance, forge their passports in order to cross the border speculate upon different types of reality, in which borders don't exist, for instance. I'm just wondering how you position your work as critical designers and speculative designers in relation to that type of conception of critical and speculative design.
I think it's a spectrum. I think we need multiple levels, multiple energies, multiple type of contexts, and I agree with what you say. It makes total sense. But I think we're working in a very different context. So in our context as teachers and educators, we're trying to figure out how do you translate this thinking into educational programs, opportunities and spaces, and adjacent kind of cultural spaces as well. And there are limitations to that, but there are also opportunities that space gives us to operate in ways that other more pragmatic and urgent contexts might not allow. So I don't really see there's one true way of doing it, but there are multiple ways of doing it, each with possibilities, shortcomings, challenges, and possibilities. And I think there should be many more even.
Okay, thank you so much. That was extremely pleasant and also a little bit kind of moving. I must confess, I appreciated very much the craft in every single object that you produce. There is so much care. At the same time, some of these elements were kind of, very intriguing and very kind of, uncomfortable somehow. So my question is, what takes you out of your comfort zone? So some of the images that you projected today when you are showing this kind of catalog of loves, it's like, oh wow, or these impossible objects made me feel like a little bit uncomfortable, which is great because that's what we're coming for the lecture too. So what kind of activities or experiences put you out of your comfort zone? How do you challenge yourselves?
In what way? I mean, what context? Strictly within design? Or?
Yes, within design, yes.
I think at the moment, we've got a project that we're evolving, and how to represent it and manifest it is challenging us. And I think we said at the beginning of our talk that we tried to reference a lot of mainstream design language because previously we wanted these ideas to sit within an imagined design world. But I think now we want, that in itself has a lot of problems and baggage attached to it. And we're trying to think about what does it mean to materialize objects that do the kind of things we're talking about tonight, maybe in very different forms that aren't so finished. and stylized and industrial looking. And I mean, the challenge for us then is experimenting and exploring. Like setting up and saying, well, no, we don't want to go here. And then seeing a space that we don't really know how to navigate and saying, let's now enter that space and see where it takes us. I mean, that's one example of something we're doing at the moment.
I think the design space is our prison. The fact that we want to constantly, anything we make, we want it to refer to a design, a dialogue with going on within the design world. And, we can easily go beyond that. That makes us very uncomfortable if we're doing something that then it's outside of that space. What determines what's inside or outside that space? I mean, that's that's a discussion which is ongoing. So I think that we're constantly aware of that. Makes us uncomfortable, definitely, when we feel like we've done something and it's kind of not addressing this kind of dialogue within a design dialogue.
There is a number of designers in the room, so I don't know if you have any kind of remark to make, like, what do you think is a current challenge that designers should take on to come up with amazing and speculative solutions, and so that we can all start thinking about a different future?
I think debating what possible means and impossible, because we kind of accept, obviously there's certain types of impossibility that are pretty impossible and will stay that way. But there are other forms that aren't actually impossible. If we think of COVID, now it flipped so many things that before that were thought of impossible. And so it's trying to find how to somehow navigate that kind of level of constraints that we either sometimes voluntarily place around our imaginations when we say things are unrealistic or they're impossible or they're not worth pursuing or whatever. And I kind of finding frameworks and stories that facilitate moving in those directions that are not usually allowed in design without it just simply becoming an undisciplined escapism or something like that. But there are many things, but that's just one thing, I think, related to tonight.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thank you for making it.
Thank you.